Living in the countryside has its advantages and disadvantages like everything else. You don't have as many people to socialize with, but you also don't have all the noise and pollution that characterizes many cities. Since I was a child, I lived at my grandparents' house. My parents got married, and as the house was quite big, they decided to live there. The house belonged to another family a long time ago, but my grandfather bought it at a very good price when he was still a young man. It was strictly forbidden to leave the house at night. Not only was it forbidden, but no one dared. You would hear footsteps outside. Sometimes you would see the silhouettes of people, and sometimes you would hear murmurs. My grandmother knew the whole area since she was very young, but this was the only one in the whole area that was affected by this kind of events. One day early in the morning, Grandpa decided to invite his old friend Abraham to the house. Abraham was a very wise man, and together with Grandfather, the whole family thought that he had the answer to what was happening in the yard at night. When night fell, Abraham showed up at the house and was amazed at how big and beautiful it was. He spent about an hour talking about how nicely carved the house's Madeira had been, and another long time telling stories about when he and my grandfather were young. After a while, my grandmother began to tell him everything that happened in the yard every night, and that it seemed like it was never going to stop. Abraham was astonished and asked my grandmother, "How long have you been listening to him?" "Since we moved into the house," answered my grandmother. Abraham, with a worried face, told us that before his father was born and his grandfather was still very young, in that place there was a church, and behind the church there was a cemetery. The father of the church had to leave town because something supernatural tried to attack him at night when he tried to go out to the courtyard. But those things did not enter the church. "My house is over a cemetery?" my grandfather asked. "Yes," Abraham answered, "and this house was once the church." He proceeded to take a parchment out of his pocket that contained a map of what was then the town, which was not much different from what it is now. There was the park, the houses of the neighbors, and some farms a little distant, but what caught my attention was the house. You could see it on the map, and except for a few details, it was almost identical on the outside to what it looks like today. Some exorcists from the Vatican came to the place to try to regain control of the church. The whole town became a chaos. Abraham said, "Black clouds covered the full moon, and the night became dark as the exorcists struggled with an evil entity. They could not defeat the entity, so they withdrew and fled in dismay. The next day, the mayor of the town and the police decided to close the church and apparently reopened it some time later." Abraham, with a slightly lost look, said, "It has been so long that I had forgotten what my father told me, who in turn told his father, and now I am telling you. This is no place to live. You don't know the danger you are in." Then Abraham stood up from his chair, took his hat, and left in a hurry. Everyone in the house was frightened and wanted to know more, so we went to the mayor's office to see if there was any record of what Abraham had told us. When we arrived, the mayor was very worried, and all the police were in front of his office. "What is it?" my grandmother asked. "Abraham," said the mayor. "He disappeared last night, and no one knows about him. The last time he was seen, he was wandering the streets of town, and some say his eyes were completely white. An unknown man was accompanying him. Abraham was in the house with us last night. We never imagined anything could happen to him." We went into the mayor's office and were greeted by his secretary, who took very good care of us. We explained what we were looking for, and he invited us into the library. It was a very old place, built in wood, but it was quite an elegant place for this town. The secretary helped us search, and we found the old maps of the town. And everything was the same as it was on the parchment Abraham showed us. Then we found a handwritten report of what had happened that night, and it really scared me, because everything he told us was confirmed. We left the office to look for Abraham with the police, the mayor, and the other neighbors. When we arrived, they found him in the woods in a creek. He was half naked, his clothes were tattered, and he was badly injured, so they took him to the hospital. We approached the mayor, who was also an elderly man, and explained to him what had happened in the house. He looked at us with concern and left with the rest of the people. The whole town went to the hospital, and we went home. Looking out the window, we saw a man standing in front of the house. He was quite tall and had long hair. That man was the one who took Abraham, I thought, but he disappeared and only darkness was visible. The next day, we received a letter from Abraham that only said, "You must go out there." grandfather and I decided to go to see him, and there he was. It already looked better than when we saw it the last time. He told us that the man who took him was an evil priest who had come to make that place his church, and he only did this to me to send the message to you. He wants to scare you because fear feeds him. Abraham described him, and it was the man we had seen in front of the house. He was an envoy of evil whose function was to carry out the plan of the entity that inhabited our property. He was already carrying out his plan, and at night he was going to proceed to perform a ritual which involved sacrificing the family living in the house. We had to get the others out of there. They didn't know what was going to happen. We ran and got there as fast as we could. We got out of there and thought that moving would solve the problem, so we went to another place. That night we were visited by Abraham, who had already recovered, and he told us that the thing was still interested in us and that it was not solved by just moving out. We were already marked. Abraham had warned the mayor of what was about to happen, and he arrived a moment after he had told us about the plan they were going to carry out against our family. We all gathered in the room and came up with a plan to fight what was tormenting us. It turned out that the mayor had a book that included a manual to fight against these types of entities. The book was in the library in his office and was left behind by the exorcists who visited the town that time. The mayor opened the book and it had a map of the church, that is, our house. It had a basement and you had to go down there, but nobody wanted to do it because the place was dark and had no light. But a few minutes later, the mayor took the initiative and we went down after him. Once inside, we saw many tombs. The house was on top of an old cemetery. Inside the cemetery were the remains of a priest, but it was not a common one. This one was dedicated to perform rites to invoke spirits from the beyond, and the church buried him there for the purpose of to keep it under their control and thus prevent the evil it contained from spreading through the town. To him belongs the house. Abraham said, "We must burn the whole house," replied the mayor. So we did, and that way we could go back to living in peace.